Hey everybody, I'm Zale Mednick, and welcome to another episode of Preconceived. The story of Titanic's sinking has captivated the hearts, minds, and curiosities of people around the world for over 100 years. The seemingly unthinkable happened. The unsinkable ship did sink. Not only did it sink, but it sunk on its much-anticipated maiden voyage, and with its sinking, over 1,500 people perished. The narrative often told is one of hubris. A ship heralding itself as unsinkable, ignores iceberg warnings, and doesn't even have enough lifeboats for all of its passengers. But is this a story where the decisions made in the building of Titanic and on the night Titanic sank any different than the decisions other shipliners and captains would have made? I'm joined today by Professor Stephanie Barczewski, a specialist in modern British history. Her latest book is How the Country House Became English. Her previous publications include Heroic Failure in the British, Country House in the British Empire, Antarctic Destinies, Scott Shackleton and the Changing Face of Heroism, and relevant to today's talk, Titanic, A Night Remembered. All right, Professor Stephanie Barczewski, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Very excited to have you on this podcast. You were featured on another podcast about Titanic, a whole series on Noiser, which you said you haven't even listened to, but you were such a fantastic guest on that podcast. And you had such interesting insights combined with your historical knowledge of the event that I needed to have you here. And this is a topic that I've really wanted to do for so long. And Titanic, it's one of my favorite movies. I think it's an amazing movie. Some people might disagree and say that's too cliche, but I think it's fantastic. But that was kind of my introduction to Titanic. Why for you is this a topic that captivated you so much that you decided to write a book on it?
I think there's two things, and the movie is actually relevant. The first thing is that I was interested in 1912. There's not just I'm a British historian by academic specialty, and in 1912 there's not just the Titanic disaster in Britain. There's also a second disaster, which is the death of an explorer named Robert Falcon Scott, who dies on his way back from the South Pole. He becomes the second person to get to the South Pole. He's beaten to the South Pole by a Norwegian explorer named Roald Amundsen, and then Scott and four of his companions die on the way back. So it might seem a long way from Titanic, but in fact it's not, because Scott dies and the Titanic sinks within about 2 weeks of each other in the spring of 1912. And I was interested in exploring the impact of kind of these two disasters on sort of British culture right before the First World War. Unfortunately, publishers were less interested in it than I was. They basically said to me, we don't think that's a very good idea, but hey, why don't you write a book on Titanic and a book on Captain Scott, two different books, basically. And that's ultimately what I ended up doing. So it was a kind of roundabout way of getting interested in the story. But once I started thinking about Titanic, which is something that I had never really thought about before, just like you, it was around the time that the James Cameron film, right, was the biggest film in, the history of movies, basically. And, as a cultural historian, I was interested in thinking about why are so many people so captivated by this story, right? What is so fascinating about the Titanic story? Why is it that we keep retelling the story over and over again? I think whatever we want to argue about the merits of the Cameron movie, I actually like it as well. And I do think if you want to see what the Titanic actually looked like, it's the best you're going to get, right? It's the recreations of the ship are, with a few minor dramatic details, pretty accurate. But I think the Cameron movie also is a really interesting take on the Titanic myth, right? If we think of the Titanic myth as kind of women and children first. And when I say myth, I don't mean it's purely fiction, right? I just mean it's the kind of narrative story that we've evolved about the disaster that can have elements of both truth and fiction. And a big part of the Titanic myth is women and children first, right? And I think, and also the class story as well, right? This idea that heroic first class men stepped aside so women and children from third class could get in the lifeboats, which we probably mostly know is in part true and in part not true, right? And I think the film is very interesting how it plays with both the gender aspects of the Titanic story, right? So we do get like Kate Winslet's character, Rose Decatur, right? She is a sort of, feminist heroine in a way that is not typical of the way the Titanic story is told. But in the end, right, the conventional gender code does reassert itself, right? She survives and Jack famously doesn't, right? I mean, everybody gets frustrated because why can't Jack get on the piece of wood too? So
Wasn't enough room.
yeah, there just wasn't. He tried, right, and it was going to sink, so he sacrificed himself, which is a reassertion, right, of that traditional kind of Titanic gender code. And then the story is really aggressive, right, in taking on the kind of class myth. And so instead of the first class characters being the heroes of the story, the first class story, the hit characters are the villains of Cameron's film, and then the third class characters like Jack Dawson, right, become the real heroes of the story. So I think the Cameron film is really interesting in how it retells the Titanic myth, maybe for a more modern audience, right? And has to deal with some of those kind of famous aspects of the story in a new way, because it's telling the story in 1997, right, is the year of the film, not 1912. So that was really how I came to it.
A lot of the fascination, I think, comes down to this idea that the Titanic was really this story of hubris. And it was touted as this unsinkable ship, and it really just got too cocky. Not enough lifeboats, went too fast, ignored glacier warnings. And ultimately, that the story of the Titanic is that it was so overconfident that it became irresponsible. As with most things, I think it's more nuanced than that, obviously. But that's certainly one of the compelling narratives and themes that gets people interested in the Titanic. Would you agree, before we kind of break that down, that that is a narrative that exists?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when we think about why is it such a powerful myth, the story of the Titanic, right? We have to take that into account. That's like a classical myth, right? Of, someone flying too close to the sun and then getting knocked down for it. It's a story of kind of overreaching human arrogance, right? I'm not saying I think it's true. I think, again, it's in part true and in part not, but I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But I think the appeal of that, right? This idea that, when people get too big for their britches, then they get knocked down a peg or two, right? I think that is a big part of the appeal of the Titanic story. I think there's so many parts of the appeal of the Titanic story, right? That's part of why it's been such an enduring and powerful story. But I think that story of hubris is certainly one.
So the way I kind of conceptualize this, and you're the expert, so you can tell me if this makes sense, is I kind of want to assess, were the decisions that were made in the preparation for the Titanic and on the night of the Titanic and after it sank, were those decisions that were reasonable at the time? And I look at it as the preparation for the voyage itself, and then kind of the handling of the crash. In terms of the preparation of the voyage, the construction of the ship, up to 4 compartments famously could fill with water, and if more were breached, then it would sink, but that was kind of seen as unthinkable. Was this a unique design, and was this really considered quite a good design, and it was just crazy unlucky that that design didn't work?
Both, right? It's a good design. It's not a particularly, innovative or radical design, right? Lots of ships by 1912 had evolved the idea of having watertight compartments, right? Separated by watertight bulkheads, walls, essentially, right? That could help to prevent a ship from sinking were it to be involved in a collision. Engineers basically thought about 2 types of collisions, right? They thought about that a ship could run head on into something, or they thought that another ship could run head on into it, right? And they thought they had kind of encompassed the full spectrum of what could possibly happen to a ship. And if you think about it, that's pretty good, right? I mean, if you think about, how accidents take place, you can either think, well, the ship's going to hit something or another ship's going to hit it. And so the Titanic was designed for that. It didn't have some of the features that it might have had that might have made it even safer, or debatably not, right? So one thing it didn't have was it didn't have a transverse bulkhead, right? So that would be a bulkhead running down the spine of the ship, essentially from bow to stern, right? That would mean that if one of those compartments got breached, it would only fill up on one side. Now that might sound great, right? That might sound like, oh, that would have stopped it from sinking, and maybe it would have in the Titanic's case, but that could also be a problem. That's part of what happened to the Lusitania, right? Was because it had a transverse bulkhead and the German torpedo hit it on one side of the ship. That side of the ship very much filled up with water, and it tilted over, which made it almost impossible for anybody to get off of that ship, right? So that was not a foolproof way. The thing that would have helped the Titanic most would have been had those watertight compartments been capped off with a watertight bulkhead at the top of them, right? And maybe some of your listeners have heard about this, because the problem that happened is when the front compartments started to fill, then the bow of the ship was pulled down and the water started to spill over the top of those, because they were open at the top, like an ice cube tray. We have to think about it, right? Not like a box, but like an ice cube tray. And the water spilled over the top of first one bulkhead and then another and another, all the way back, right, basically to the stern of the ship. And then eventually the entire ship was pulled under. So if they had capped off those watertight bulkheads at the top, then that might have saved the ship. But we have to remember that watertight bulkheads are a real pain when you're thinking about people having to move around the ship. And if you're talking about capping them off at the top, then you've got a bulkhead that's in a place where passengers and crew need to move around the ship. If you're way down at the bottom, it doesn't matter that much. But if you're up on B deck, which I think is where most of Titanic's bulkheads ended, I might be wrong about that, that's a part that people need to be able to move around the ship, and watertight bulkheads make that very, very difficult. And when you've got Titanic, a ship that's designed for comfort and luxury first and foremost, that's just not a great combination. And so there were rational reasons why they chose to design the safety features. And again, they thought by having it where those watertight compartments would be okay in the event of a head-on collision, or be okay in the event of something running into the side of the ship, then they thought they had accounted for most possibilities. I think it's not unreasonable, right? We just sometimes get surprised, and we can probably all think in our minds of other disasters, right? I'll let the audience kind of imagine those other disasters where we thought we had, this couldn't possibly happen, and then we hadn't taken into account some alternative possibility. And I think that's sort of what happens to the Titanic.
What was it about the Titanic that led to, I don't know if it was even the ship company that heralded it as unsinkable, but people heralding it as unsinkable? Was it based on any safety features, or it was just based on how large it was and this idea of it's such a great ship?
I think it was bad. It was never claimed by White Star, the owner of Titanic themselves. It was never claimed by anybody who built the ship or sailed the ship. Although, famously Captain Edward Smith of the Titanic did say in an interview some years before that, long before he was ever captain of the Titanic, so he was not speaking about the Titanic specifically, but he did say, I can't imagine a disaster that would cause a big ship to founder, to sink, right? He thought that maritime technology had gone past that point, right? There hadn't been a major maritime disaster in a very, very long time in 1912. So there was a certain degree of complacency. I mean, I think, whatever we want to do with the kind of hubris side of the Titanic myth, and actually kind of cross the line from complacency into arrogance, I think we can't help but look at complacency as a factor. I'm not saying I think it's the primary factor, but it was there because people sort of, there hadn't been a major maritime disaster for a long time, and people assumed the kind of maritime technology was able to, whatever the precise configuration of these watertight bulkheads, I don't think people were thinking, it mattered, whether you had a transverse bulkhead or whether you had the bulkheads capped off. I think they thought the bulkheads themselves on most of these big ships were making them pretty foolproof. Now, they're going to find out quite quickly that wasn't true, right? Because we're not only going to get the Titanic sinking, right? We're going to get the Empress of Ireland sinking in Canada, right? Which is another almost Titanic scale disaster. And we're going to get the Lusitania sinking, right? In 1915. We're going to get those all like bing, 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 right? In a row. So it's going to prove very quickly that these big ships are not invulnerable. And in fact, in some ways, their size and their safety configurations are making them actually a little bit more vulnerable in a way.
When the Titanic does hit, it's something that obviously wasn't anticipated in terms of that mechanism. You said that people thought, let's make this safe enough for these ships that it can hit another ship or that it can be hit by a ship. When it hits the glacier, was it such a fluke that they never would have thought that a glacier would scrape it to that degree? Because when you're talking about the two obvious ways it could get hurt are by other ships, wouldn't they have thought about glaciers too?
They thought about icebergs, certainly.
Icebergs.
That's okay. Things made of ice, right? So they certainly thought about icebergs, right? Icebergs were a formidable danger to ships in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. They were aware in 1912 that it was a particularly bad year for ice. There was an unusually large number of icebergs. I think it had been kind of a warm winter, right, which had caused more icebergs to break off, right, from essentially the kind of Arctic coast, right? And these icebergs had drifted in large numbers into the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Everybody was aware of that in 1912. So icebergs were taken seriously, right? That's why the Titanic had, some of these watertight compartments. That's why they had lookouts looking out for icebergs, right? The famous cry when they see it, iceberg dead ahead. That's what they're looking for, right? They're not out there looking for whales or seals or walruses, right? They're looking for icebergs. So they took them very seriously. But it is also the case that the way that, and the more I think about the Titanic story, the more I think about this, right? The way that the Titanic hits that iceberg, you couldn't have done it on purpose, right? If William Murdoch, who was in charge of the ship, right, the officer who's in charge of the ship at that fateful moment, right, if they had said to him, hit the iceberg in this way where it's going to scrape along the side and it's going to open this little slit. It's not even a continuous slit in the side of the ship. It's like dots and dashes, right? I mean, we just had I think it was National Geographic, right? Just went down with some really high tech camera equipment and was able to actually, get, I mean, it didn't tell us anything. I mean, these things are always presented to us as revelations about the Titanic, and it told us exactly what we already know, right? Some guy at I forget whether it was the British or American inquiry right after the disaster, he calculated based on how fast the ship sank, the total size of the hole and the size of the ship. He calculated it to be about 12 square feet, which is the size of a door, basically. That's the total area of the Titanic that was open to the sea, right?
Wild.
Crazy, right? Completely crazy. It's small. It's a tiny hole considering how big that ship was. And it's not, it's not even one big hole, right? It's just these little things, probably
it's
only
this long gash.
Well, it's not even a long gash. It's like a series of short gashes, I think is probably the more accurate way to think about it. But the fateful thing about it, right, is that they extend into 6 compartments, right? And you've already mentioned that it could only float with 4 of the compartments breached. And so once it got to the 6th one, it was inevitable, right? But Murdoch couldn't have done that if he tried. I mean, they could have given him a million tests, right? And they would have said, try to hit the ship in this way that's going to open this. And you couldn't have done it. And I think that's a really important part of the Titanic story. We can talk about who's at fault. We can talk about complacency. We can talk about hubris and arrogance. We can talk about faulty design. But it's still just such colossal bad luck at the end of the day. They could have hit that iceberg in any other way, right? They could have smacked into it. And if they smacked into it, he probably would have killed 100, 200 people in the bow of the ship, right? But the ship would have survived. But that's not a decision Murdoch can make, right? If he sees any chance to get around it, he's going to try to get around it. And this is where we come back to, too, the size of the ship, right? That we have to remember that it's big. No one's really used to maneuvering a ship that big. There's always been some discussion about the Titanic that the rudder was too small for the ship. Maybe, right? It doesn't turn well, for sure. He also does, I think, what anybody sane would have done, which is he tries to reverse the engines to slow the ship down, right? To buy himself a little bit more time to try to get around the iceberg. But when he does that, he burbles the water around the rudder, and that makes it even harder because the rudder can't get good purchase in the water to turn, right? It's like a car trying to turn on ice or oily spot or something, right? It can't get grip there. So, he's making, I think, rational decisions in that fateful moment, but all of those decisions add up to just this colossal piece of bad luck that ship hits the iceberg in this just the worst possible way. I mean, if he'd hit it, I suspect if there had just been a few feet of difference, right, he would have missed it entirely, or he would have hit it so hard that it would have opened a bigger hole, but in a smaller part of the ship, if that makes sense. I mean, the ship could have withstood a giant hole in 1 or 2 compartments, that would have been perfectly fine. And I think that's such a key part of the story. And we often don't really think about that, right? Just what a colossal bad luck that was.
And like you said, if he hit it straight on, maybe 150 people would have died, but that's not a decision anybody would have made, and he would have been fired immediately for that decision.
Yeah, I mean,
because nobody could have predicted that this would have happened by making the decision he made.
I mean, who knows? But I suspect you're right. I mean, I suspect it would have been said, hey, the ship, could have probably survived either way, so why didn't you try to get around it, right? I mean, there just would have been no if it hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't have any idea that that type of collision to a ship could happen, right? I mean, I don't, maybe there is another one. I mean, people who are more, I'm a cultural historian, not a maritime historian, and there may be other maritime historians who could say there's an example of another ship having a collision with an iceberg in that way, where it just scrapes along the side and kind of opens a cut in the side of the ship. But I don't know of one, right? It's a really hard thing to do if you think about it.
When you look at preparation and hubris, there's a lot of points in this story where lifeboats come up, obviously. One thing that I learned from listening to the podcast you were on was that the idea of lifeboats actually was more as ferries, that and that gave me a lot more context as to, while it might have been an arrogant thing to not have enough lifeboats, it was thought that if a ship were to sink, these lifeboats would be used to kind of ferry passengers to the ship that was helping them, and then the lifeboats would go back, which gives a little bit of logic to why they didn't need lifeboats for any but for to fit everybody. What was the thought process at the time of why they didn't have lifeboats? Was it Can we look at that as one of the points of hubris, or did a lot of ships at the time not have enough lifeboats because they viewed them as more of ferries in between ships as opposed to vessels that would save people and they'd be floating and needed enough capacity for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to this idea that they thought that sort of maritime technology, right, had outstripped the ability to cause a disaster like the Titanic. The Titanic had a perfectly normal number of lifeboats, right? It was in full compliance with any legal requirement for lifeboats, and in fact had more lifeboats than it needed to have legally, right? I think it had 4 extra lifeboats. Some of that was a little ridiculous because, the one of the most famous lifeboats on Titanic, right, is collapsible lifeboat B, right? So that's one, you see it in the film, actually, in the Cameron film. It was lashed to the top of the deck house, right? Basically, kind of lashed to the top of the bridge of the Titanic. And it completely, I mean, if you think about like a ship is sinking and you're trying to get a lifeboat launched, and then you've got this thing that's tied to the very top of the ship. I mean, it was impossible to get it down. They did manage to get it loose just before the ship sank, and it actually washes off the ship upside down, right? And then Charles Lightoller, one of the ship's officers, and mostly other crew members, they survived by kind of trying to stand and balance on the top of that thing all night long. So, I mean, that's a good example of how they thought they were never going to have to use those lifeboats, right? So, yeah, they thought of lifeboats as having a variety of purposes, including, ferrying passengers to another ship potentially. They just didn't really think of them as you were ever going to have to put everybody in a lifeboat. It's also the case that they're not really thinking about, right, how long on a ship the size of Titanic, because we have to think about how fast ships were getting bigger in the early 20th century, right? It's just this exponential, we go from the age of, what we would think of as like a sailing ship, right? So have your vision of a 19th century sailing ship going across the Atlantic to the Titanic in like 50 years. So it's a huge change. It's a huge change from wooden ships to iron and steel ships, right? It's a huge change from sailing ships to ships with steam engines and then eventually with diesel engines. And it's all happening very, very fast. And the ships are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And all of the details of sailing a ship just aren't keeping up with that, right? And lifeboats are one of those. And they're not really thinking too, and we can think about this as we think about trying to get those lifeboats loaded on the Titanic, right? That how long it takes to get those lifeboats loaded. I mean, for anybody who's listening who's ever been on a cruise, right? And you think about when you go in on a cruise, sometimes you're lucky and there's a dock that can handle a big cruise ship, but sometimes it can't, right? And some of these ports, and so you have to be tendered off. You essentially have to be taken off in a lifeboat. Think of how long you had to queue up, right, to get off the ship. And, it takes a long time to load thousands of people. Think about getting on an airplane, how long that takes, and that's just a couple hundred people, right? So, it's just a really cumbersome process, which accounts for some of why the Titanic lifeboats were loaded in the way they did. There's a lot of factors there, but that certainly was part of the picture, is it just takes a long time to get lifeboats loaded.
If we look to the voyage itself now, what do you view as some of the areas of, I guess, greatest controversy about why this happened? A lot of people talk about, did Captain Smith do something wrong? Did they not heed iceberg warnings sufficiently? Why don't we start with the icebergs and if they heated them sufficiently? Because there were a lot of warnings that night that they got on their radio system about icebergs. Did they do anything that other ships wouldn't have done, though, in regards to those icebergs? Like, what was typical protocol, and did they veer from that? And I guess that ties in with Captain Smith, because he's the captain and would have made the calls on that.
Well, I think we have to say they didn't heed them sufficiently, right? Because they hit an iceberg. So, that's I mean, I think that there's like prima facie evidence that they didn't. I mean, if they had been more attentive to the warnings, they might not have hit an iceberg, right? But having said that,
I guess the better way of phrasing that is, with the information they had,
sure,
were their decisions reasonable at the time before they hit?
Yeah, and I'm not trying to be entirely facetious here. I just think, that's an important point, right? That yes, they should have heeded the iceberg warnings better because they might not have hit an iceberg, right? That's, but having said that, right, they weren't doing anything that any other ship wouldn't have done. Like, some of the, there is the famous story of the Californian, right, which is the ship that might have been in a position to get to the Titanic faster, but decides to not really investigate, right, these weird lights and flashes that it's seeing on the horizon. The Californian had stopped because of ice, basically, because they weren't going to sail through a field of ice at night. But the Californian is a tin pot freighter, right? It's not under any pressure from really wealthy passengers and powerful people to get to New York on time, right? The Titanic is much bigger. It's thinking of itself as much less vulnerable to hitting an iceberg than a ship like the Californian would be. And it's also thinking, what these passengers on this ship have paid for, right, is a quick and smooth journey across the Atlantic. Again, think of how frustrated you get if your airplane flight is delayed or your other travel arrangements are delayed, right? People get grumpy. And when the people getting grumpy are the John Jacob Astors and the Benjamin Guggenheims of the world, then that's a lot of pressure on White Star. And so I think the Titanic is behaving in a perfectly normal way. I think Captain Smith is making, what with hindsight seem perhaps like irrational decisions, but in the context that he's dealing with are probably pretty rational decisions about how to deal with this. We also have to think about most of these ice warnings they're getting over the radio. I think one or two of them they got because they were close enough to another ship that they actually got kind of like a little Morse code light flashes sort of thing directly from that ship. Most of them are coming over the radio. Radio is in its very early infancy as a maritime technology. In 1912, this is something that captains have never really had before. You could see Smith kind of being like, well, if I'd been sailing this thing 3 years ago, I wouldn't even have had this information. So why would I, really, I've never hit an iceberg before. Why would I really react to it? Probably, I've been on lots of voyages where if we'd had radio, I would have been getting all these ice warnings. It's really the radio that's causing the ice warnings, not the ice, right? And so I think he's making reasonable decisions based on what was standard maritime practice at the time. It's just with hindsight, we know they were completely unreasonable, right? When the sun comes up that morning, right, the morning of April 15th, 1912, they're surrounded by ice, right? There's icebergs everywhere. It's not like they got unlucky and hit the one iceberg that was floating out there in the North Atlantic. I mean, there's ice all over the place, right? They're in the middle of a very dangerous ice field. The Carpathia that does come to rescue the passengers, right? It has to dodge ice kind of all night long, right? That the captain of the Carpathia has got lots of lookouts posted because he knows, right, that there's ice everywhere, and they were probably lucky not to hit one themselves as fast as they were going. So it's one of those things that, it's hard to say, oh, Captain Smith, that was, he caused the disaster. I mean, I don't think he does, but, it's also hard to avoid saying they didn't take seriously what, with hindsight, was a obvious danger, of which they were very aware.
Do you think there's any credence to the notion that there was pressure that was put on by people on the ship or some of the higher ups, like Bruce Ismay saying, we want to get there sooner. Don't slow down. We actually want to speed up because we want to surprise them in New York by getting there faster. Do you think that actually came into play with the decision making? That comes up in the movie Titanic, and some people have commented on that in history, but is there enough evidence to really say that was a motivating factor?
The evidence is one passenger at one of the inquiries said that happened, said that there was a conversation that she overheard a conversation between J. Bruce Ismay, who's the managing director of the White Star Line, who's on board the ship for the maiden voyage, and Captain Smith, in which she overheard Ismay basically pressuring Captain Smith to try to get into New York the night before. So the appearance of that scene in the Cameron film is not a dramatic embellishment because it is based on something that was actually testified to at one of the inquiries. Now, it's only one passenger who says it. I have always been a little bit dubious about it. The Titanic was not built for speed. It was built for comfort and luxury. It is not in any way the fastest ship on the North Atlantic. That still belonged to the Cunard ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, who are much, much faster ships than the Titanic was. And I'm extremely dubious that they would have been trying to get into New York the night before, because docking a ship the size of Titanic at night when the crew on shore who were supposed to be doing this weren't prepared to do it, I just can't think that they would have actually attempted that. So I'm not quite sure what the purpose of pushing would have been. I can see that it would have been more plausible that there may have been some reason because of maybe minor course changes to do with the icebergs, maybe because Titanic was not quite even going at the maximum speed it could go at because there had been a coal strike back in Britain and it was having to conserve coal a little bit on the journey across the North Atlantic. That maybe Ismay was getting a little bit itchy that they were going to be late, right? And that might have been a more plausible scenario, right? That's not what the passenger actually said, that that Ismay was pushing Smith to get in significantly early. I could just see that, maybe Ismay just, you could see if you're the managing director of White Star and you're on board the ship and you want everything to be perfect, right? I mean, he's he's feeling under pressure, right? To have everything perfect, because he wants to show off this amazing new ship that White Star has put on the ocean. And so you could see him maybe getting caught in a mindset there where he's thinking, "Oh, I don't want to be, I don't want to be even a little bit late." And so maybe he expressed some concern to Smith about that. I mean, that's just pure speculation. I have no idea. It just strikes me as a little bit more plausible. If such a conversation did take place, it strikes me as that's maybe a little bit more plausible a context for it than pushing to get into New York the night before. I just don't understand why that would have even been thought of as a good idea.
What are some of the main kind of areas that you or other people think these are mistakes that Captain Smith or other people made during this voyage that people point back to and say, why did they do that? And do you think there's credence to those things?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, mistakes during the voyage. I mean, I think most of them have to do with again, with the icebergs, right? With being aware that you're in, it's a very bad spring for ice, and you've now received numerous ice warnings that are telling you that you're entering into what is a pretty massive ice field. I think that's if we're going to talk about, sort of mistakes. I mean, I think, we have to sort of start and stop there, right? I don't know that it's a mistake, but I think that's the thing that matters, right? I mean, if we're talking about the voyage itself, not what happens once they hit the iceberg.
So they hit the iceberg. As you said, Murdoch tries to turn. It's unsuccessful in the weirdest stroke of unluck that there could possibly be. When the iceberg crashes, one of the things that's so fascinating to me about this story, which I see when I watch the movie and whenever I listen or read anything about Titanic, is the notion that it all happens so quickly. Thomas Andrews, the architect of the ship, says we've got about 2 hours left before this sinks. And to go through the steps mentally and psychologically where people are processing this in real time, probably realizing for many of them who ended up perishing that I'm not going to get on a boat, and having to come to grips with the fact that I'm going to be in the water and I'm going to probably die within such a short period of time. That's such a rare phenomena. That's such a rare phenomenon. In the 2 hours or so that they have to kind of load the lifeboats, is it just sheer chaos on the ship, or are the lifeboats loaded in an organized fashion? Because you mentioned earlier that it would be challenging to really get those lifeboats loaded, even if there were sufficient lifeboats. And we know there were so many lifeboats that weren't loaded properly. What was the vibe like on the ship? And was there a lack of urgency maybe initially? Because, like I said, there was only a very short amount of time to process this.
So I think the first thing we have to remember is, in some ways, it is a short amount of time, right? It's 2 hours and 40 minutes, right? They hit the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th. The ship sinks at 2:20 a.m. on April 15th. So it's 2 hours and 40 minutes. It is a short amount of time when you think about suddenly people go from having, long lives ahead of them, right, to having 2 hours and 40 minutes left in those lives. It's a short amount of time. By shipwreck standards, though, it is a very long amount of time, right? And I think this is one of the things that makes the Titanic story very distinctive, is that 2 hours and 40 minutes, because in shipwreck time, it's enormous. So I mentioned the other two great kind of pre-enduring World War I disasters. Empress of Ireland, which gets hit in the St. Lawrence Seaway in Canada and sinks in 14 minutes. The Lusitania gets hit in 1915 by a German U-boat torpedo and sinks in 18 minutes. So the Titanic, there is much, much, much more time. And if we think about the Titanic story and we think about all the things that we know about the Titanic myth, right, a lot of them are because of all the things that unfold in that 2 hours and 40 minutes. There's a lot of time for things to happen. And then, as you also said, that 2 hours and 40 minutes goes from, in the beginning, a sense of like, what's going on? Most passengers don't feel the collision. A few of them describe it as like, it felt like we ran over some marbles or a little bit of a vibration. What they notice is that the ship stops, right? And then they're kind of like, hey, what's going on? As that's happening, as you also mentioned, right? Thomas Andrews, who supervised the building of the Titanic at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast in Northern Ireland, right? He goes down, conducts an inspection, and becomes, with Captain Smith, and they become really the first two people to realize how bad this is, right? Andrews calculates that the ship has an hour or two before it's going to sink. He actually has built a really good ship because it survives for almost 3, right? And that's important. It gives people more time to get off the ship, right? Time is what they need, right? They need time for another ship to get there. They need time to load the lifeboats. And so the fact that Titanic lasts for almost 3 hours after that collision, right, tells you that it was a good ship, right? There's nothing faulty with the sort of construction of the ship in that sense. It withstands enormous forces in that time as well. And so, so there's a lot of things going on, right? So it goes from Andrews and Smith being the only people who know, the passengers kind of being like, why have we stopped? But not really having any sense of imminent danger, right? And then things start to unfold. They start to uncover the lifeboats. They start to, the lifeboats are hanging, right, from these cables and these crane-like things called davits, right? They're swung out over the side of the ship so that they can drop them down into the sea. And then the passengers start to go, But a lot of them still don't really believe that anything terrible is happening. And I think the ship's crew, the commanding officers, are wrestling with the dilemma of how to balance, right, keeping people calm because you don't want to panic, with trying to instill some sense of urgency so the people actually board the lifeboats. And they have a hard time with that one, right? Initially, people don't want to get on the lifeboats. They're like, it's cold because it's cold that night, right? They don't want to board the lifeboats. And so they're having a hard time getting, convincing people. And then we get this slow build. And I do think the film does a pretty good job with it. This slow build as the night goes on of kind of increasing panic, right? And it starts to become clear, right, that something serious is happening, right? The bow of the ship starts to go down, right? The stern of the ship starts to come up. People can feel that as they're walking around. They can feel the ship's out of kilter. Some of the people on the ship who have maritime experience are going, like it doesn't feel right when you walk down the stairs. That shouldn't be happening, right? The stairs don't feel even anymore. And there starts to be this kind of slow realization. And then you've got thousands of people who are processing this in their own way, right? Some are very calm. Some are very panicked. Some are, are trying desperately to save themselves. Others are sort of resigning themselves to their fate. But I think that's where the Titanic story really starts to take shape, right? It's in that 2 hours and 40 minutes, which I think makes Titanic a very unique disaster because there is in fact so much time for so many stories to unfold.
Wow. So I didn't realize that that's considered a very, very long amount of time, which makes it even more tragic because you can look back at that 2 hours and 40 minutes and say, wait a second, why didn't they do a better job? So the lifeboats, many of the first ones that went out were very, very lightly filled. I think one had about 12 people on it and it had the capacity for 40. Um, Sounds like there was issues convincing people initially to get on the lifeboats. And were how long did it take until people from the steerage, for example, even knew that they needed to get onto lifeboats?
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on there, right? So yes, you're right. I mean, the lifeboats go off, particularly the first ones, right? Go off with often less than half full, right? I mean, one of my, I suppose it's sad, but it's one of my kind of favorite moments from the story is when one of the crew members looks down and sees one of the first lifeboats in the water, and he thinks, if they're going to launch the lifeboats, they might as well put some people in them, because he sees like 12 people in a lifeboat that can hold 50 people. And so that absolutely is true. A lot of the lifeboats the lifeboats end up in total with about 2/3 of the people who they could have held. Another third could have fit in those lifeboats. I think there's a couple things that are causing that, right? I think you're absolutely right that one of them is that the passengers just don't believe that the ship is going to sink. They certainly don't believe it's going to sink fast enough that it'll sink before help can get there. It's freezing cold out there, right? And everybody's like, oh, I'm on the nice warm Titanic. The lights are still on, everything's still working on the Titanic, right? And they're thinking, why on earth would I want to get in a lifeboat? So initially there's that, right? There's also the issue of the famous or infamous, depending on how we want to think of it, right? Women and children first policy, because we've got one of the officers, Murdoch, on one side of the ship loading the lifeboats, and he's interpreting that as women and children first, right? So he puts women and children in the lifeboats, and then if he can't find anybody else, he puts men in the lifeboats. Charles Lightoller, on the other side of the ship, interprets it as women and children only. And so even if there are empty seats on the lifeboats, he will not allow men to get in the lifeboats. I mean, it's interesting because Murdoch becomes a kind of villain, right? Because he's the one who's actually steering the ship at the time of the collision. He's shown in the Cameron film as committing suicide, which there were reports that passengers saw an officer committing suicide. There were none connecting it directly to Murdoch. Murdoch was from Scotland. He was from a town called Dalbeattie in Scotland. And when the Cameron film came out, the people of Dalbeattie were very unhappy about the depiction of Murdoch committing suicide as a result. So Murdoch becomes this kind of quasi-villain of the story. Lightoller becomes a great hero because he's the guy who ends up on top of collapsible lifeboat B. He's very heroic in helping those mostly crew members survive in the night, getting them to lean this way and that so that the lifeboat doesn't sink. And he comes off later as this kind of macho hero of the story. In fact, Lightoller kills a lot of people, right? Because he won't fill the lifeboats completely. So if we're going to look at, heroes and villains, we have to think about that aspect of the story as well. Murdoch saves, right, men because he lets them get in the lifeboats when there's empty seats, right? Lightoller ends up killing people. So that's another factor in why the lifeboats are not fully loaded.
What's the rationale there? I mean, it seems like, yes, women and children first, but obviously if there's empty seats, you would fill them with men. Did Lightoller think it would be too chaotic if you let a couple men on to fill those extra seats, and it's going to cause kind of competition to get on the lifeboats?
I don't think it's anything that
strange.
I don't think it's anything that rational. I think it's the Edwardian, 1912 gender codes, right? That men are supposed to heroically die, right? I mean, it's sort of like, the captain's supposed to go down with the ship, right? Men are supposed to, step aside so that women and children can be saved. It's a sense of masculinity and femininity, right? That, we still have, we still argue these things in our society. I guess I'll just leave it there. But I think it's much more rigid in 1912 than it is now. And I think, the very tone of your question suggests, like, we think that's silly, right? I mean, it's ludicrous that somebody would do that.
Not necessarily. I don't think they thought it was ludicrous in 1912,
right? I think Lightoller just thinks that's that's how gender codes work, right? I mean, it seems crazy to us, but that's part of what's fascinating about history, right? As our attitudes change. And I mean, I think
Yeah.
about, there's another Titanic film, right, which I really like. So if your listeners haven't seen it, like, they should see it, which is, I think it's 1953. It's an earlier Hollywood film that it's Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb and a young Robert Wagner, who I knew in the 80s is like the star of Heart to Heart, right? He plays this kind of young stud in the film, right? And and the film is really interesting because Barbara Stanwyck is an actress who much like Kate Winslet in the 1997 one, she's not a wallflower, right? She's not a pushover. She's famous for being a kind of sassy woman actress, like in a lot of her movies, not just this one. And that's who she is in this one as well. But at the end of the film, even more aggressively than the Cameron film, right? The gender code gets reasserted because they have a little boy, like he's like 8 or something, or 10 maybe, and it's like he has to die at the end of the film because he's male, right? It's like this incredibly rigid gender code. So I think we look at these now and we go, that's silly, but I think that attitude survives, right? That's not seen as
Mhm.
stupid in the 1953 film. It's actually seen as sort of noble, right? Um, and I think that survives for a very long time, right? This idea that you save women and men die in shipwrecks.
Yeah. And I mean, the idea to me, I mean, I think it would be controversial now even. Should women and not children, but should women have preferential treatment for the lifeboats over men? To me, the more egregious idea, which again, clearly I'm biased based on how the culture in which I've grown up, is more that it's better to have empty seats than to have men there if the order was women and children
Yeah,
first.
I mean, I think that's right, and I think now it is interesting, right? How would we negotiate that in a similar situation, right? Would it just be kind of every person for themselves, right? Because suddenly it would be like we have gender equality, right? So we shouldn't give preference to women, right? I mean, I suppose there's some implicit part of it that's arguing that because men are physically stronger than women, that they would have a better chance of survival, right? Maybe that's part of the kind of background of that. But even that we would probably question, right? Because not all men would be more physically capable of surviving than a particularly fit woman, right? So but I think it's interesting. I don't know of any cases with modern shipwrecks, but it would be interesting to look, right? How has that been negotiated, right, with modern shipwrecks? I mean, do men just run over women on the way to the lifeboats, or what or do women run over men on the way to lifeboats? I mean, I don't know, right? Like, what does it play a role at all, right? Are there cases where men have, stepped aside and given up their places to a woman because they believe in a sort of old fashioned notion of chivalry? There probably have been, right? It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, men still give up their seats on subways and things like that to women. So
It's reflective to an extent, just thinking about it, of kind of our ethos in society, as we're more selfish people now, and there's a lot of focus on the human, whereas back then, again, that's not to say that their policies were good, but there is some sort of chivalry that you can look at, or some sort of sense of community to an extent in having some of those values, whereas you could see a situation now where everybody's just running for themselves, and there is even less regard on the polar opposite of the spectrum for other
yeah, I think
people.
it cuts both ways, right? I think we would look at it as, in some ways, I think most people would look at it. I mean, I realize, again, these things are still discussed, that it's good that we have greater gender equality, right? It's good that we don't, women couldn't vote, right, in 1912 in either the United States or Britain. So I think we would view it as it's good that we have a more equal society. Um, but we've also lost some stuff, right? We've lost a notion of chivalry. We've lost a notion of trying to make decisions based on, some sense of nobility or self-sacrifice, right? Like we might have, I mean, again, I suspect that it survives a little bit, but it's not a kind of social code, right? In the way that it was in 1912. And again, when you're asking me, like, why would Lightoller do that? That seems silly. It's because he's obeying what he sees as the perfectly normal social code, right, of the time.
The last, and maybe I'm wrong, but the last major decision that kind of strikes me is the lifeboats not coming back. Um, and I know somebody testified in court afterwards explaining that they decided they were going to come back when, I forget the phrasing he used, but it came off negatively, even though the point made sense. They wanted kind of more people to die and the voices to kind of quiet, to indicate that more people had already frozen to death before going back so that these boats weren't completely just sunk by people trying to get into them. Would it have been a suicide mission for these boats to have come back earlier? Is there validity to that argument that some of the people on the lifeboat said as to why it took them so long to go back? Or could realistically they have gone back sooner to save more people? And obviously there's no specific, obviously there's no concrete answer to
Yeah,
that, but
I mean, clearly they could have gone back sooner, right? I mean, that I think it's fifth officer. I'm not always great on which officer is which, but I think he's fifth officer Lowe, right? Lowe. He's the one who testifies, as you referenced, and then he's shown in the film doing the same thing, right? He is the one, right? So in some ways we can view him as ruthless, and in some ways we can view him as heroic because he's the only one who goes back, right? But he does ruthlessly kind of sit there and wait for the screams to kind of die down, and then he goes back. And by the time he goes back, it's too late, right? He's not calculating enough how cold that water is, right? People aren't drowning, right? They've got life jackets. They're freezing because the water, salt water can go below freezing before it freezes, basically. So the water is about 30 degrees. Most people have about 20 minutes before they're going to die, right? It's really, really, really cold water. You just can't survive very long in it. So Lowe calculates, he waits for the screams to die down, and he says, okay, we're going back, right? And it's shown in the film. They only managed to find 3 people who are still alive, right? And I think one of them dies later, so he only ended up saving 2 people. So clearly, like, they could have gone back earlier and not, even if the argument was that they were going to be swamped by desperate people, there was a moment when they could have gone back earlier. Now, how you calculate that precisely, I don't know. I think the bigger point here is human nature, right? That we have to think about that those people, and I think about this a lot when we think about how people respond in a crisis, right? How people, they will put their own survival ahead of everything. I mean, we have to, right? As human beings, right? We have to have this kind of fight or flight instinct, right? But it's not a nice one. It's not a pretty one necessarily. And it's really not pretty on the Titanic, right? Because, those lifeboats go off, and they're sitting there, right? More than a dozen of them. They're out there in the water. They can hear all those people screaming in the water. Again, they're not drowning. They're not dying instantly. They're taking time, right? They're taking 20 minutes to slowly die of hypothermia. And it's not just random people in the water, right? It's not just strangers in the water. It's your husband or your son or your father, right? It's there, pretty much everybody in those lifeboats knows there's somebody in the water who they know, right? Who's a close relative, who's a loved one. They still don't go back, right? They still don't. There's no, there's stories of Molly Brown, right? Famously trying to argue with the crew member who's in charge of her lifeboat to go back, right? Maybe it happened, but none of them do. And I don't think it's really a calculation of like, they were going to be swamped. They might have been. I mean, I'm not arguing that. I mean, it could have been very chaotic if they had tried to go back and get people. But I think really what they're doing is saying, I'm safe. This is scary. And I'm not taking any more risk tonight. Like I have been saved, and I'm one of the lucky ones. And sort of, my human brain, my psyche can't handle taking on more risk tonight. Right. And it doesn't matter that it's my husband or my brother or my son or my dad in the water. I'm going to survive, right? And I think that's human nature. And I think I'm not trying to say this in any kind of condemnatory way. I think we would all behave that way. I think it is a rare person who would put saving those people ahead of their own personal safety, right? I wish it were different in some ways. I wish people were different. But I think that's one, when we look at the Titanic story and we think about lessons learned, I think in some ways that's a more important one than could they have avoided the iceberg, right? I think it's important to look at the Titanic story and learn what it tells us about human nature, not with any kind of idea that we're all terrible and we're horrible people and we won't do noble and great things. It's just like, let's just be realistic, right? About sort of who we are and how we're going to behave, because I think it's good to have that kind of sense of self-awareness about ourselves and about people generally.
And I think that's one of the compelling pieces of the story, is that it's easy for us to imagine ourselves in those situations and wonder kind of what would I have done if I were faced with that similar situation? Would I have been that hero? And we all like to think we would have been that hero that would have gone back or that would have given up our seat for somebody else. But I mean, it's impossible to know until you're in that moment. And human nature certainly suggests that, I mean, they did not go back.
Odds are you would not have been that hero, right? I mean, 1 in 1,000 people is that hero. I mean, it's like, when we think about World War II in Europe now, right? Everybody was in the resistance, I mean, everybody in France and everybody in Italy was in the resistance. Well, they weren't, right? Most people just, tried to save themselves. And that's fine. I mean, that's what people do. We don't need to condemn it, but we need to be aware of it.
Do you think people like stories in general where the mighty fall? Is that one of the things that compels people with Titanic? You look at the Titan, the submersible, which imploded a few years ago, and there's parallels. It's obviously not the same. I know a new documentary just came out about it on Netflix, which I haven't seen, but in a sense, people were very quick. You're mesmerized by a tragedy because you feel bad, but immediately with the Titan, you could see it in real time. People were coming out blaming them. They shouldn't have gone down. That shouldn't have been allowed. And with the Titanic, it seems like there was a similar thing. Even when we talk about it, we look at it and we say, that's so sad. It's a tragedy. But then there's also, okay, we got to put the blame somewhere. And it's very easy to put the blame at hubris, this ship and the staff. It's their fault. Is that just natural human nature as well?
I mean, I think there's a tension, right, with the Titanic story, and I think we saw the same tension in the context of many decades later, right, with the Titan submersible, of this tension between we admire and envy and glamorize the wealthy and powerful, right, but we also don't like them, right? We also feel like that they're that we want to see them knock down a peg or two, as you said, right? And I think the Titanic story has elements of that. I mean, we do have to remember that a lot of the initial Titanic myth does emphasize the heroism of the upper classes, right? So somebody like Benjamin Guggenheim, right, who's this New York billionaire, right? So, he's on board the ship, and he famously, as the ship is sinking, we see it in the film, right? He famously goes and puts on his evening clothes, right? Puts on top hat and tails, right? Comes out with his valet, right? His valet, as they would say in the UK, which I'll talk about a little bit more in just a second. And he says famously, we are dressed in our best and we are going to go down like gentlemen. And that becomes like a very admired thing, right? That scene is like, wow, that was really cool that Ben Guggenheim did that, right? He was very noble and not fighting to get in a lifeboat, right? He's contrasted to somebody like J. Bruce Ismay, who does get in a lifeboat, right? Ismay's one of those classic men who he's kind of helping to load a lifeboat. The lifeboat's about to go off. There's empty places in the lifeboat. He doesn't knock anybody aside. He doesn't take a place that was going to anybody else. It's perfectly reasonable and rational for him to do it. He gets in a lifeboat, and then he's demonized for the rest of his life for doing it, right? Guggenheim is seen as the exemplar of how to behave. Ismay isn't. The thing that always strikes me about the Guggenheim story, though, is that valet, right? He says we. He doesn't say I am dressed in my best and I am going to go down like a gentleman. He says we, right? Does the valet want to do this? Does the valet the valet's like, hey, I might actually like to get in a lifeboat. I don't want to play this scene out with you, this heroic scene of upper class male heroism and chivalry, right? I don't know. Maybe he did, right? I don't know, but we don't know what choice he would have made. And his choices in the story is taken away from him, right? He's just an adjunct to it. We don't even know. I'm sure he has a name, but it's never even in the story. I don't know his name, right? I should look that up. Actually, I should learn that guy's name because it's because I'm talking about his oppression and I don't even know his name. So I think there's always that sort of tension in these sorts of stories. I think that was a lot of the tension with the Titan submersible, that it was like, oh, these rich people, right? They paid whatever it was, hundreds of thousands of dollars to go down there, and they sort of got what they deserved, right? They were kind of splashing their money around in this kind of irresponsible way. There's a little bit of envy, right? I think a lot of people look at that with some envy that they have the money to do that. Like a lot of people think I'd like to go down and see the Titanic, but it costs $300,000 or whatever it costs. It's not something that the vast, vast, vast majority of humanity could ever afford to do. So I think there's a sort of tension between envy and then when it happened, we all went, oh, well, those rich playboy types or whatever, they got what they deserved because they were sort of doing this thing that was very frivolous and luxurious and ultimately not safe, right? And so, they sort of got their just desserts for doing it. So I think there's always, kind of a tension. I think we always need blame, right? We always, and I think a lot of the Titanic story it's always looking for something or someone to blame. I think that's part of why the story remains so compelling, because there's no easy answers to that, right? There's not one smoking gun with a Titanic story. There's not a person you can point to. You can say, well, if Murdoch had done something differently, if Smith had heeded the ice warnings, but you can't really point to any of it and say, definitively, this person caused it. You can't say definitively this flaw of the ship caused it, that this particular decision caused it. It's, there's so many things that have to add up to put the Titanic in the path of that iceberg and have it hit the iceberg in the way that it did, that there's just no way to point to one thing in that chain of a million events that leads to the disaster and say, this was at fault. But I think you're right that a big part of the myth-making aspect of the Titanic story is trying to find somewhere to put that. And I think when we look at all the different iterations of the myth, we look at every film, right? It's going to put the blame on a different thing, right? Is going to point to something different as the cause of the disaster. So I think it's a hugely important part of what we need as humans to get out of that story, because we need to understand it. And in order to understand it, we need to know what caused it, right? What was at fault?
Well, Professor Stephanie Barczewski, you've been so fantastic in giving us fact about what happened and also in your perspectives. And I think a lot of the fascination comes down to what we learn about human nature in such an interesting story. And you've done such a good job of elucidating that. And what are you working on now in your research?
I am working on, as a British historian, I'm actually working on British national parks, right? So national parks, we think of as like, Yellowstone, that it's like a thing with you go through a gate, you pay to get in, and then it's nobody lives there. And it's this, kind of preserved wilderness. British national parks are very weird by American standards. Like, people live in them. They don't really know when you're going in and out of them. And so I'm working on the kind of unique history of British national parks, and how they evolved from kind of very different social and cultural forces from how the ones in America did.
Well, that's super interesting, and I will put a link to your work in the episode notes. Thank you so much for joining me, Professor Stephanie Barczewski from Clemson University.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, everybody, for listening to another episode of Preconceived. Have a great day.